Yesterday I filmed a short about Adnan Syed from NPR's Serial, I guess technically the New York Times podcast Serial. He was released from prison earlier this week after over 20 years. And a lot of people commented saying, hey, we want something longer, a little bit more in depth. First of all, go listen to Serial. They dropped season 1, episode 13 or whatever it is. Very nostalgic to hear that old, this is a phone call from a Maryland correctional institution. I hear that a lot in Pennsylvania, but it was interesting to hear it. Something I haven't heard in many, many years since Serial first came out. So what happened? This isn't the standard, someone gets released from prison after all these years because DNA comes back or something like that. First of all, there's been a hit podcast, right? Anyone that's listened to a podcast has probably listened to Serial. You've probably listened to Serial. I've listened to it more than once in the season since then. But the first season of Serial really did reinvigorate the entire podcast medium. So it investigated the case, Adnan Syed, Sarah Koenig, then at NPR, investigating, what really happened. Was this person unjustly prosecuted or unjustly convicted, etc.? And she doesn't really come to a conclusion at the end of the podcast. Now, since then, Adnan has been fighting his conviction. He was fighting it then, and he was fighting it all the way through today. The case isn't over yet. So he had originally appealed. That was denied. He filed what we would call in Pennsylvania a PCRA, essentially a claim for ineffective assistance of counsel. He was alleging that his counsel at trial, his lawyer at trial, was ineffective. And if you've heard Serial and heard some of the things that went on at trial, I mean, it's only snippets, but it did not sound good. There were definitely many times when my wife and I were in the car listening to that show, and then I was kind of exclaiming, like, what? What is this lawyer doing? What is this lawyer saying? And actually, there's a whole episode where Sarah Koenig says, if you're listening to this with a lawyer, they're probably saying, what is this lawyer saying? And that's exactly what I have been doing because it was straight shenanigans at various points. So they tried to file a motion to get the case overturned for that reason. Didn't work. At the trial court level, that was denied. Went up to their intermediate appellate court. It was granted. So now Adnan's thinking, all right, great, I'm going to get a new trial, going to get out. Unfortunately for him, the state did appeal that to the highest court in Maryland, which reversed. What does that mean? So the highest court in Maryland said, no, we think trial counsel here was effective, and that was kind of that. Until a year ago. Fast forward a year, Maryland enacted new legislation, and essentially in Maryland, if you're a juvenile and you've been convicted of a crime and you've served over 20 years for that crime, you can have your case reevaluated by the court and a potential early release. Home confinement, shortened sentence, whatever. Put a pause on that for 1 second. First of all, Pennsylvania doesn't have anything like that. But secondly, 20 years? So if someone's 17, they're going to do 20 years before the case can be evaluated? I mean, I applaud Maryland for even having some kind of option for that. But damn, 20 years, that is a long time, especially when you've started in jail at 16 or 17. I mean, you're serving half your life over again. And that's what Adnan did. So once this law went into effect, Adnan's lawyers go to the prosecutors and say, hey, we want this case to be reevaluated. It goes to their election integrity. Yeah, like that's what we're worried about. It goes to their conviction integrity unit. What's that? So prosecutors around the country have started implementing these units where they have someone that looks at old convictions to see, was something a little shady here? Was there new DNA testing available? Is there something we could do to make sure that this was really the person who committed this crime? So this case goes to the prosecution integrity unit in Maryland, and the attorney there starts looking at it. And the attorney there, this is important, former public defender, right? So she's got her head on her shoulders of, okay, was this person wrongly convicted? And if you listen to the latest episode of Serial, the reporting is this person starts kind of pulling at threads and saying, wait a minute here. This J person, his testimony doesn't really make sense. It changes half a dozen times. This cell phone GPS data, does that really hold up? They end up re-interviewing or getting new experts to look at the cell phone data. And those experts say, what you used in the 90s to prosecute this guy was kind of junk science, and what those experts testified to isn't really how it works. So that's one piece of it. They realized that the testimony they had used in the 90s, the science wasn't great, their witness wasn't great, and they're thinking, can we really, with full confidence, say we're sure that this testimony was reliable and this person should still be in prison? But then there's the icing on the cake. And this by itself, by the way, is enough to overturn the conviction. The prosecutor is going through their file, and they find notes from the former prosecutor back in the 90s of 2 different reports that the police or the district attorney received about another suspect, 2 other suspects, both of whom, according to the prosecutor, had the means, motive, and opportunity to kill Hae Min Lee. And that's who Adnan was convicted of killing, is Hae Min Lee, his former girlfriend, etc. You've heard the show. You know who it is. So, that evidence was never turned over to the defense. That's huge. Huge. That's called a Brady violation. The government has an obligation to turn over anything exculpatory, meaning things that could lead towards your innocence or lead towards an acquittal. Have you seen My Cousin Vinny? There's a scene where he asks to go see the prosecutor's file and they let him see everything. That's what that is. They have to turn over discovery, and if they don't, it's a Brady violation. And you can get your conviction reversed for a Brady violation, especially one like this, where it's huge, right? 2 other possible suspects who both were heard making threats to the victim in the case. Bad prosecutor work back in the 90s, very bad. Now, what we haven't heard is whether there's an investigation into that prosecutor or any kind of bar discipline or what's going on with that, because it's still early. So anyway, all these things come to light. And then it's the prosecutor's office that goes to the court and says, Judge, we can't in good faith stand by this prosecution. We're asking that the judgment be overturned and the case kind of start from scratch. They wanted Adnan's family wanted him to come out immediately. Obviously, get out. If there's going to be a new trial, let's fight it from the streets. Obviously, the victim's family wants him to stay in. Let's see what's happening. So the judge grants the defense/prosecution request for Adnan to get out. That's how he gets out of jail. Now, he's on home confinement, and the prosecutor has to decide if they're going to pursue the case or not. But as of right now, I mean, it looks very slim. They would have to re-prosecute this guy, and the case wasn't strong in the 90s. It ain't getting any stronger. I can't imagine all those witnesses are still around. They found out that the science they relied on in terms of the cell phone data is totally garbage. So, terrific news for Adnan. Now, I got a couple of questions in the comments when I posted this earlier. How big of an impact did the podcast have, as well as, what does this mean for other defendants? As far as what it means for other defendants, almost nothing. If they're in Maryland, in this county, maybe something. You know that you got a prosecutor's office that's taking its job seriously. Of course, the flip side of that, the pessimistic side of that, has to look at, is this person up for election? This is a popular case. What's going on with that? But for other defendants, that you have a prosecutor's office that, at least in this case, was taking things seriously. Does that mean they're going to do that in every case? In every case where they think things are on the line, are they going to go back to the court? Probably not. But it is good news for people in Maryland, especially in this county. What does it mean for people in Pennsylvania? Absolutely nothing. The laws in Maryland, we don't have anything like that up here in Pennsylvania. Now, how big an impact does the podcast have, or did the podcast have on this outcome? I would say significant. I don't know who's coming up with the money for all these lawyers, but there is a lot of publicity in it for the lawyers, so that probably helps with things. Obviously, the court's also familiar with the case, but the trial court, the appellate courts, everyone's familiar with the case. So that definitely does, I would think, help. I don't know if it helps Adnan or helps the prosecution. I guess it depends on which side you were on when you were listening and what you thought of the reporting. But being aware of the case, kind of having that general name recognition can't have hurt. Would this case have been overturned if there hadn't been a podcast? Maybe, maybe not. Tough to tell. There's plenty of cases overturned every year across the country, but also many, many that should never have been convicted that go through anyway, that don't have a Sarah Koenig doing the investigation. So we'll see. I don't know what the next steps are going to be. They have to decide, they being the prosecutor, what they're going to do next. And we'll stay tuned. I'll do another short whenever there's an update. And it sounds like Ciro's going to drop another episode if there is an update. But it sounds like for Adnan, this might be it. He might be out after all this time. And now he's got to try to find a job. And that's a 22-year gap in his resume. So it could be tough.